Thanks again for everyone joining. So we'll begin. Matt will actually walk through some ideas around Audit Map, where it began, and then we'll actually walk through the platform so you can see Audit Map working with AI live. So what we'll do is, if you have any questions throughout the presentation or throughout the demo of the platform, what I'll do is I'll unmute you so you can ask the questions to Matt directly. That way it's a little bit easier. We tried last time, people writing questions down, and there was a lot of questions. So we figured we'll just unmute, have you ask questions directly, but we really appreciate everyone coming online. So Matt, I'll hand it off to you so you can begin, and appreciate everyone's time.
Thanks, Warren. And thanks everyone on the call today to make some time to review our latest advancements using Audit Map. Some of you are familiar, so I do need to give a shout out to a few names that I recognize. If you know who you are and you speak Italian, just give a nice wave. For the rest of you, if this is your first time reviewing the tool, or if it's something new to you, or you had some ideas about Audit Map, we're going to walk through today the philosophy behind it, how we build the tool, and we're going to review over a few cases. Right before we get started, my name is Matt Lemay. I'm CEO and co-founder of Audit Map. We've been working on this tool for the last few years. It's now been deployed successfully on multiple client sites. My background is actually closer to what you would call internal audit in the medical device realm. And that you'll see a few hints of that popping up for the presentation, but the application of internal audit is very similar to all the various types of contexts that you would see. And we're going to show you some clear examples as to what we can do with it. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to have a quick three-part presentation, and we're going to start about what is the idea behind Audit Map, how does it work, how is it relevant to internal auditors. We're going to show a few use cases on how you can apply these key features, and we're going to proceed to demonstrating a few capabilities that could be of interest to a lot of internal auditors on the call today. Like Warren said, if you have a question, just raise your hand. We'll unmute your mic after these 3 points, and then we'll have a nice simple QA till the top of the hour. So let's start by talking about Audit Map. And Audit Map does have a lot of applications as our tool suite works in internal audit, enterprise risk, and market intelligence. But today's presentation is really about its application to alleviating the total amount of work that internal auditors face on a daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly basis. So let's start off with the latest improvements of the 3 lines model. So what are the roles and responsibilities of internal audit? The new model looks at internal audit as being defined as independent and objective assurance and advice on all matters related to achievement of objectives. So the first thing to notice here is that they introduce a new word if you look at the other definition, which is advice, which means that the internal audit team now is more of an active participant in the overall success of the organization or of their clients. But there's also a few words here that are interesting, which are the achievement of objectives. We know that the goal of internal audit is to identify risks and mitigate them with effective controls in order to better achieve target objectives. So how do we actually define risk, which is relevant to how our tool is applied? Well, we know that the IIA defines risk as potential impacts of uncertainty on objectives. So you have a risk that may prevent you from accomplishing an objective. You put controls in place to mitigate those risks. Great. There's 2 key words here that you want to focus on. There's potential and there's impact. If you have more of an ISO background, then how risk is also measured is by looking at what is the probability of something bad happening times what is the actual damage that this particular risk materializing may cause. That means that if you want to be a successful internal auditor and you want to provide successful advice, you have to understand that risk mitigation is the reduction of probability and impact in order to better achieve these target objectives. Hopefully, I'm not teaching anything new to anyone on the line here. Now, there's two other definitions that we're gonna cover quickly before we dive into the tool itself. So if you look at risk-based decision-making, that means that all of your processes need to take into account the potential impacts of uncertainty on objectives every step of the way. So there's an obligation to not only identify these potential impacts, but the assurance can really come from maintaining awareness of these risks throughout the review process, which brings us to the next word of the day, which is assurance. Assurance relies on independent confirmation and confidence. So for the exam at the end, I've highlighted the keywords here, which relate to what is of importance for internal auditors. When we talk about providing assurance, we do need verifiable confirmation that the controls are effective, and we need to do so with confidence, which means we need to review a large amount of these controls and their effectiveness in order to be confident in our reporting. So far, so good. Here's the problem. The problem is that there's just too much data to provide confirmation and confidence on your risk mitigation advice. First off, you can't see changes in risks through time or through different geographies. Oftentimes you don't know what are the total mentions of weak passwords in your past internal audit reports. It's very difficult to review and manually search for each one of those because there's no way of counting what are the total mentions that exist. There's a tremendous amount of human bias. If you have an IT security background, you're not gonna find the same risks that someone with a specialization in social sciences or even in financial oversight would have. It's very difficult to identify coverage gaps. What are the audits that you should have been performing over the last few years? It's very difficult to say with confidence that no, we didn't look at these particular components, and there's actually a reason why we didn't look at them. Languages also becomes an issue. We were lucky enough to work with a few clients where our tool works in English, French, German, Arabic, Hebrew, with expansion in Portuguese, but not a lot of people in the internal audit team is able to collect all of that information and review the entirety of the documentation. Not only are they not able to review the multiple languages, they have a sample-based approach right now where they intentionally skip over documents that they feel may be irrelevant, although the only way to truly verify if it is irrelevant is to read the entire document. On top of that, if a new report comes out from your organization, by the time it makes it to the decision makers, there is a risk that that particular threat materializes before you have the chance to provide some corrective and preventative actions around that threat. And so all in all, the key crux of the problem here is that there's too much problem. There's too much text and too much data for you to review. So what does this mean? This means that how can you be sure that you have reviewed all of your document stock in its entirety? How can you confirm that you are effective in the particular delivery of the recommendations that you provide? And how can you provide advice if you don't know what went well and what didn't in the past? All of this put together is really what motivates the Audit Map product. If you look at what we built, our goal is to review all of the corporate reports that are relevant to internal auditors. We're talking about performance assessments, we're talking about internal audit reports, even some of your past audit plans you want to collect and analyze to identify what are the risks that have been mentioned, What are the controls that have been tested, that are in place, or that exist? And what are the off-the-cuffs recommendations, the findings, the observations that would be relevant to your particular investigation? What we do, as opposed to people that like to focus on a first step and then building out their document set in their particular investigation, is we allow our clients to review the entirety of the data at once, not only through workflows, but through activities, through better implemented search. And so they're able to bring up to the surface what is actually happening within their organization. As well, if you look at the particular industry that you're in, if you look at the type of work that you do as an internal auditor, then you will use different risk management frameworks. So IT security relies a lot on COBIT. North American internal auditors, especially in the private sector, rely a lot on COSO. Europeans are switching more and more to ISO 31000. And we know that there's a few other frameworks that are of interest. So not just FINMA and TSC, but also we had some clients request that we implement the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a risk management framework in order to understand their own effectiveness as part of their corporate mission. If we look at the different types of risks that can be found, we do have a few auditors that come up to us and say, your tool doesn't actually identify risk, it identifies observation. So let's just contextualize that. What our tool does is it identifies not just key mentions of risk, but also opportunities for improvement that usually showcases an absence or shortcoming of effectiveness. It also looks at the drivers of risk, which are what are the environmental conditions and behaviors that may lead to the emergence or materialization of risk. Let's look at a quick example. If I mention an example of a driver of risk, one of our favorite ones so far is still employees seem to be unaware of the difference between confidential and anonymous. That is, in traditional IA speak, this is simply an observation. However, there are a lot of issues that exist within the organization if this particular observation is correct. And so as an internal audit, it's very important to know that if you're looking at your database security, if you're looking at your data privacy concerns, if you're looking at any GDPR concerns, that you want to make sure that you are aware of this observation. The second one that we have, which is a true process risk, someone noticed in the past report that 25 of the 32 reimbursements above $25,000 did not have a director's signature. Has that been fixed? Has that been corrected? Is that now prevented? What happened to those past payments? We want to be able to verify those. And also, a little fun one that we see often in restaurants, employees really should wash their hands after using the washroom. Yes, it's just a recommendation, but if it's not implemented, it could be a health risk. And so as part of your investigation, you should, of course, review that. What does this mean if you analyze these types of sentences? It means that you have a better approach in order to have risk management-based auditing. You start from a top-down approach to evaluating what is the risk context of your organization. You know how often certain risks exist, and so you can better plan your audits around the fact that you have a lot of context in terms of the information before you. As opposed to more, call it traditional internal audit, which was control-based, what we like to do is think of the top-down approach as being a bit more effective and aware of not only what are the trends that exist, but also what are the coverage gaps that you may not have investigated. And so if you want to pursue effective risk mitigation and provide assurance and advice to for the well-being of your client or for your organization, you want to make sure that you just don't go out and test the controls. You understand why you're testing certain controls. You want to know why you're evaluating certain key aspects of the organization. and you want to prioritize it with all the information that you would otherwise miss if you just followed a simple sample-based approach. Now, what does this mean when you're engaging with a process is that instead of looking at just a particular topic of saying, what are the past audits that we've seen in the past that look at database security, instead what we say is, let's put all of the historical documented risks with all of the reports that you have in a centralized location. From there, you can start a first filtering to identify what are the most relevant risks that have been brought up in these reports that you want to include in your investigation. Then you can build your target risk list that you're actually going to go out and test. You can add to that key domain risks that you're aware of. So if you're looking at financial controls, you know that there's going to be a lot of payment traceability in play. If you're in IT security, you're going to, of course, look at backups. You're going to look at mandatory password lengths. And then you can actually build out the engagement risk register that would allow you to successfully audit the particular functions that you're interested in. In traditional auditing, there's multiple steps that happen over and over and over again, and the Audit Map tool is intended to accelerate key functions of the internal audit process. So if you look at the ability to properly define the scope, we keep hearing stories that people usually face a guessing game. What happened in the news, what happened to their competitors, what happened in the past, what do people remember? But if you can prioritize your list in terms of what you actually have within your documentation, then it's a lot easier to define the scope much, much faster, and then you can go in and start doing your audits. Your knowledge gathering and interviews is going to be the same, because that's the part of the legwork of being an internal auditor, is understanding what is actually happening. And then we move back to isolating the key risks. In the previous slide, we explained how we can actually build the risk register. That's what we're talking about here. Control data collection, that's all your metrics, all your KPIs, all the processes and procedures that are actually in place, and what are the results that exist. From there, you can move on to actually performing a risk-based testing of these controls. If you know that there has been some historical mentions of ineffective controls, and if you know that you have some reoccurring risks, those are going to be the ones that you're going to prioritize in your testing, at which point you're going to be able to go to your report generation. Another thing that we've seen a lot is in terms of follow-ups and assurance, it's very difficult for people to sometimes ensure that the report that they've written has been successfully communicated to their client, to the head of the organization, to the CAE. But if you have some work products and some reports that exist within the tool, it's much easier to share and interact with in order to have more effective internal audit processes. Now we can start talking about key use cases. We can talk about flagging the indicators of risk. We're going to look at the absence of documentation, and then we're going to do a quick program assessment. The first thing that we're going to do is, let's say I want to identify what are the key indicators of risk. We still have our main sentence here that says employees seem to be unaware of the difference between confidential and anonymous. That means that my ability to find this information and verify all of the controls against it is much more effective if I'm able to have a much lighter touch review of my historical documentation, instead of deliberately looking at each one of the reports. We had one client that came up to us and said, we reviewed manually 125 reports. We had forgotten 99% of it. That means that if you are curious about certain types of risk, it's not something that's easy to interact with unless you have a mechanism for quickly retrieving those risks and putting them into context. The other one that we like a lot was the audit team was unable to confirm destruction due to lack of historical information on 2 projects. Well, this is an obvious first step in your review, is to do a quick follow-up to say, are you now able to confirm destruction of these of sensitive information on these two projects? That's going to be your starting point. If you look at other tools that may exist out there, there is a lot of compliance mechanisms in place. However, we find that if you can add a lot of this contextualized information in just your list of risks in a very dynamic fashion, then your ability to pursue those investigations with relevant and up-to-date information goes much faster. The second thing that we have is looking at where are you missing documentation. Sure, you didn't have any risks that popped up when we look at CRA in 2017, but it's also because we don't have actually that much documentation associated with it. That means that you can actually show up with a much more contextualized aspect of the total number of risks. You can come in and say, well, we know that there aren't any risks because we didn't look at this particular topic, institution, or entity in the last 3 years. Therefore, that's probably where we're going to want to prioritize our next investigation. And third, if you have, this is a quick thought exercise that we did for a client. The Canadian federal government does have a new benefits program out for employees, for individuals and for companies, the Canadian Emergency Bank Account and the Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit. Now, there are a few issues surrounding the audit of this new program. Because it's brand new, it doesn't have a lot of information. There's no previous assessments that are available. There might be very low program maturity, so even though there are controls that could be in place, there's a good chance that the controls are just not effective whatsoever, but there's no actual way of knowing. But what we do know is that the benefits payments are typically administered by the same individuals and other departments. Therefore, if you want to review this particular program, it's a lot easier if you start off by reviewing similar programs, and then you build out your audit plan and the risk register by knowing what are the similar risks that may exist. Now, the fun part, we're actually going to go to the demo. So as we talked about before, we do want to see what are the potential coverage gaps, so we're going to review the entities. And we're going to look at some of the workflows in order to build out these particular investigations. In this case, we're going to build a quick risk and control matrix. The first thing that I want to explain about this demo is that we already uploaded 27 different files regarding Veterans Affairs in Canada, a lot of the benefits from the Canadian Revenue Agency, from ESDC. So it is geared and themed a bit more towards government, but it is very applicable to the banking sector as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a quick search of and a quick overview of the benefits programs document that we have right now. So at the top, we know that we've ingested 27 documents. We have about 14,000 sentences. Of those, our tool flagged 1,400 sentences that are of interest. The high-level view in this particular risk management framework, we know that the overall distribution, there's a few missing sentences in control environment, but overall, it's a well-balanced data set and seems to have an overall effective review of all things that are going on. So let's look at key sentences that I want to be interested in. I'm going to start off by looking at the word data and filtering for risk because I want to understand what is going on here. So if I the goal of this particular exploration tab is first and foremost to give you as much high-level views as possible of your document set. Yes, there are a lot of sentences, but because of the fact that I can filter quickly and search for key sentences, I can understand what's going on. Now, here's one of the key sentences that were brought up. Data integrity improves systems controls, and automation would improve data integrity and result in efficiencies. That's great. So that is a very strong recommendation. We put it in our opportunities for improvement bucket. Why? Where does a sentence exist? So with our tool, we can clearly find what is the context of the sentence, the file that it's in, and understand, should I, as the internal auditor, include this as part of my present engagement. We'll get back to it during the next phase of the demo, but overall you can see how did our AI models actually perform, how well did they actually label this information, in which category did it place this information, and if you find that you're seeing that our tool made a few mistakes, AI overall is reliable, but just like humans, it makes mistakes. There's an easy relabeling mechanism, and you can also search for file summaries here. So as part of the search, it's very easy to have a conversation with the data and to fix the key issues that might arise. Now, the other thing that we have is if I'm interested instead in looking at the CRA entities that we looked about before. So the Canada Revenue Agency, how often is it mentioned in my documentation, especially if I'm going to review their particular programs? I want to be aware of how often they've been talked about. So looking at the total number of mentions, I can actually see how often are they present in my document stock, and what are the key sentences that relate to these particular to this particular institution. I can go a bit further and find that there are 16 risks that explicitly state this entity, and if I want to save it for later, I can export it, and now I can go back to my present investigations. What we have as well is at the high-level view, when you start the particular search, you're faced with this page that allows you to navigate the information. You can see the trends year over year. You can see the distribution of risks and controls. So we can see that for this particular client and for this particular document set, there is a nice consistent ratio of risks and controls that allow me to understand that it's not so much how many controls exist and how many risks exist. It's more that I know that what I'm reviewing in terms of documentation on a year-over-year basis is very, very clear. You can search just the same way for these particular sentences. You can export the total amount of risks that exist, and then you can go back to see what's going on. If we look at certain key terms that are of interest here, you can just navigate very lightly. You can navigate very deeply. And what we talked about before is that when you're building out your risk register, you want to identify certain topics. So you want to identify data as a potential source of risk. You want to identify payments as a source of risk. Payment and overpayment is one that we see often. So you have this information at your fingertips at the beginning of your engagement, as opposed to having to navigate all of your document stock manually. That's the first thing. The second thing that we have, now that we've completed just a high-level exploration and search and a more serendipitous awareness of what's going on, we're actually going to build out an activity that's going to assist us, the internal auditor, in reviewing these specific features that would allow us to have a successful engagement with our client. So what we're going to build is a risk and control matrix using this document set. So I go to benefits payment, and we're just going to go back quickly. And what we've done in our tool is we've actually showed that it's possible to create multiple workflows. So when we're talking about activities and workflows, we talk about creating risk and control matrices, coverage gaps, communicating insights to leadership, maybe diving a bit more into market intelligence, and understanding what is the lay of the land in terms of what your competitors might be afraid of. Now, this document stock that we're talking about in market intelligence is surrounding 10K and 10Q public filings. We don't share any client information whatsoever because our tool is intended to be deployed on premise. That means that all your data is kept secret, even from us. You're in charge of the corrections, and we don't see anything that's going on the back end. So going back to the building of the risk and control matrix, I'm going to start off by giving it a quick title and description. And now I'm going to look for the key risks that I feel are important to flag as part of my search. There's a few here that I'm interested in reviewing. So we know that we're providing payments to individuals. So I'm going to search for key terms relating to payments. And the other thing that I find interesting that starts coming up is the fact that overpayment is also a key term that keeps popping up. So we could see here, there's three things that I immediately want to investigate. Generic reasons for overpayment, such as administration error, are captured in the client delivery network, but adequate detail is not captured. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is this actually fixed? If I'm in charge of investigating this benefits program, I want to assess, do we now have adequate detail? There's a few of the risks that we've included here, including developing an exception report of the account adjustments would distinguish between the overpayment and account adjustments. Again, like we said before, this is a recommendation that would feed into the first one. We absolutely want to include it. The next thing we do is we know that our investigation is related to information surrounding the payments and overpayments. So during my searching a bit earlier, I found that there's one control in place that talks about the policies and procedures to address this information management requirement. And we also know that there's this particular control, or at least mentioned that program information is created and collected throughout the intake, adjudication, and the payment as well. So there should be two controls that exist where the information surrounding the payments going out to individuals is properly tracked. When I'm building this tool, I also want to make sure that I have contextual information. So all of the insights and observations we've also included here. So we know that the CRA also adopted ESDC, existing collection practices and processes. That means that one institution has the processes from another. That's where I can find more information. That's going to help me when I'm reviewing this program. After, I'm going to confirm that, yes, this is indeed what I want to assess. And now I can go and create the relationships. So very dynamic tool. I can review the risks, the controls. I can assess the relationships and the effectiveness of these controls, or at least the assumed effectiveness. And I can go back in the field and actually test these controls if they are properly mitigating the risks that we mentioned. From there, I have a nice work product that I can share with the rest of my team that I can export and go back and do my job. The important thing here is that it took me a few minutes to create a very simple risk and control matrix. And in the context of speed of providing assurance in your functions, then you know that you have reviewed the entirety of the information. So that was two quick examples of what was going on. And also, This concludes the review of the tool as it stands right now. And we're going to open the floor to some questions from the people in the audience.
Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, just raise your hand and you can ask them. I'll unmute you and you can ask the questions directly. Or if you want, you can text them through the chat. So we'll open it up for questions now. And hopefully the raising the hand works. So.
Yeah, so while we're just waiting for questions to pop up here, one quick review that we've had is the fact that this tool was built around the fact that there is simply too much documentation out there, and any type of support that internal auditors, internal audit directors, chief audit executives would benefit from comes from the ability to ingest, flag, and label these particular sentences in the context of their investigation. We do have some people that talk about how does our tool work with, let's say, some other tools out there. What we say is that effective risk mitigation has two components to it. The first one is that it has strong and stringent compliance, which is the goal of a lot of the platforms out there. And on top of that, our information and awareness tool provides very strong governance. The combination of those two things allows for people to successfully perform their testing of the processes and procedures that they may have in place.
Matt, we have a question. Someone's asked, could you explain more about the audit frameworks that we use, like an example, COSO, COBIT?
Absolutely. So depending on the key frameworks that you use, they have different levels of prescriptivity. So we know that COSO is very direct, it's very exact, whereas ISO 31000 is intended to be a lot more flexible and a lot more iterative. What we've done is we started off by encoding key components of COSO. So if you look at COSO ICFR, we've taken the subsection where there is context around these risk management, around the key pillars of COSO, and said, for a particular risk or control that is identified, does it also meet the descriptive criteria of this particular pillar? That means that when I do perform an investigation, I can actually create a search for risks, not just in payments, but just in the overall context of risk assessment. That means that if you're using our tool, you have the ability to change in between different frameworks when you upload your documents. So if I want to know more about just overall what is happening in communication and information, and all my risk sentences within this particular pillar, I can dynamically search for the information. The goal of having these different risk management frameworks is intended to work with whatever ones you might have. So we know that the Canadian federal government works a lot more with trust services criteria, which was our first risk management framework that we developed. And really the goal is to make sure that the way we identify risk is in the same context as you interpret risk within your organization. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the raising hand part is working. So if anyone has any questions, they can add it into the chat, which I'm trying to open up now. We'll give it another minute and we'll end the call. So if there's anybody that would like to have a more one-on-one demo talk about very specifics around use cases that you're working with, please, by all means, I'll shoot you an email afterwards with the deck, so you have the copy of the presentation, and that way, if there's anything directly you want to ask, we can do that. Also, inviting other team members, if you have other folks on your teams that want to see the demo or talk about Audit Map, let us know. So,
absolutely. And another thing is that as we're growing the tool, we're giving more and more webinars that are going to be geared towards people in government, in the finance sector, people that are looking for other use cases, walking through example audits that we've seen in the past. That's also going to be part of the projects that not only we build, but maybe some example projects that clients are interested in, and so forth.
So there's another question that came in explaining whether it's a cloud-based solution or an in-house solution that we're working with.
It's actually both. So we are going through our SOC 2 compliance and ensuring that our platform meets all of the security requirements in the cloud. However, we don't feel comfortable right now having our cloud platform be the basis for critical corporate information. If you look at the latest internal audit reviews and polls that came out, the number one concern at about 40% is everything related to IT security. The number one concern in IT security is third-party vendor management, which directly pertains to cloud. And also, we don't want to run the risk that we have any leak whatsoever with the data, because look at Capital One. They just suffered a last-minute switch in configuration and suffered $150 million data breach. A few people got fired. That's not the approach we want to take. So we use cloud for usually public up to sensitive information, and then we move on premise. We also have a few hosting facilities ourselves, so we have the ability to host on protected V. Usually what we'll do is work with the client to find a suitable on-premise solution for their needs.
That's great. So I don't think there's any other questions at this time. So like I said, I'll send out an email, I'll send a presentation to everyone who joined. And by all means, let us know if you want to have a more direct presentation to your team. We're happy to do so, and maybe even have an opportunity to try the platform out with your own data. But we appreciate everyone taking the time. And like I said, I'll send an email. If anybody has any questions in the meantime, just shoot me a quick note. Thanks again for joining.
All right, thanks a lot, guys.